Take a moment and imagine your home exactly as it is today. Perhaps there's a vacuum cleaner tucked away in a closet, a mop leaning against the wall, running water waiting at the turn of tap, maybe a washing machine quietly humming in another room, or a dishwasher patiently tackling the dishes while you relax after dinner. If a room becomes dusty, you can usually clean it in a matter of minutes. If a window is dirty, a bottle of glass cleaner is never far away. Now imagine that every single one of those conveniences disappears. No electricity, no vacuum cleaner, no plumbing, no electric lights, no central heating, no detergents, no rubber gloves, no paper towels. Now make your house about 50 times larger. Replace your cozy hallway with endless stone corridors. Replace your living room with a hall large enough to host hundreds of guests. Add towering staircases, narrow, winding passages, dozens of fireplaces, drafty towers, kitchens the size of small houses, stables filled with horses, workshops buzzing with activity, storerooms overflowing with supplies, and bedrooms scattered across several floors. Congratulations! You now have something that vaguely resembles a medieval castle. It may sound romantic. After all, castles occupy a special place in our imagination. They are the backdrop for fairy tales, heroic legends, royal weddings, and epic battles. Their towering walls still dominate hilltops across Europe, attracting millions of visitors every year. We picture banners fluttering proudly from stone towers, knights riding through massive gates, and kings seated upon magnificent thrones. Rarely do we stop to ask a much less glamorous question. Who cleaned all of it? Every morning, before the castle truly came to life, an invisible army of workers was already awake. Long before the lord of the castle climbed out of bed. Long before breakfast appeared on polished tables. Long before the first visitor crossed the drawbridge. Someone had already begun sweeping. Someone was carrying water. Someone was removing ashes from yesterday's fires. Someone was hauling heavy buckets through freezing corridors. Someone was cleaning rooms that would become dirty all over again before sunset. Unlike the noble families who lived comfortably behind thick stone walls, these workers rarely appeared in paintings or stories. Chroniclers preferred to write about tournaments, wars, marriages, and royal ceremonies. They celebrated kings and queens, famous knights, and powerful bishops. The people holding the broom were usually forgotten. And yet, without them, medieval castles would have become almost uninhabitable. When we think about dirt today, we usually imagine a little dust collecting on a bookshelf or footprints across a freshly mopped floor. Medieval people faced something entirely different. A castle was not simply a home. It was a fortress, a military headquarters, a government office, a courthouse, a warehouse, a prison, a marketplace, sometimes even an entire village enclosed within stone walls. Depending on the season, hundreds of people might pass through its gates every single day. Soldiers returned from patrol with mud covering their boots. Messengers arrived after riding for days across rain-soaked roads. Merchants unloaded barrels, sacks, and crates. Blacksmiths hammered iron in nearby workshops. Kitchen servants carried firewood and fresh meat across courtyards. Stable boys led horses that had spent hours trudging through fields and forests. Dogs wandered freely. Chickens occasionally escaped where they shouldn't. Cats hunted mice beneath tables. The castle was constantly alive. And where there is life, there is mess. Lots of it. Unlike modern buildings with smooth painted walls and polished flooring, castles were built primarily from rough stone and heavy timber. Tiny cracks collected dust. Uneven floors trapped dirt. Smoke from fireplaces slowly coated ceilings with dark soot. Straw, rushes, ash, mud, spilled ale, candle wax, animal hair, scraps of food, and bits of clothing all found their way into the daily environment. There was no magical moment when everything suddenly became clean again. Only people with aching backs, people carrying buckets, people endlessly sweeping, scrubbing, washing, lifting, replacing, repairing, and starting over the next morning. Cleaning a medieval castle was never a task that could truly be finished. It was a cycle. an endless rhythm repeated every single day of the year. In many ways, that rhythm began before sunrise. Imagine stepping outside into the cold darkness of a winter morning sometime around the year 1300. The stars still shine above the castle towers. The air bites at your face. Your breath hangs in pale clouds before disappearing into the night. Most of the castle is silent. The Lord sleeps. His family sleeps. The guests sleep. Even many of the guards quietly pace along the walls wrapped tightly in wool cloaks. But down below, hidden from the grand chambers above, another world is already awake. Small flames flicker inside kitchens. Wood is stacked beside great hearths. Buckets scrape across stone floors. Someone coughs after breathing yesterday's smoke. Another servant yawns before lifting yet another load of firewood. Nobody applauds their work. Nobody writes songs about them. Yet by the time the castle's noble residents finally awaken, much of the invisible labor has already been completed. The floors have been swept. The fires have been rekindled. Fresh water has been carried where it is needed. The Great Hall has begun its transformation from yesterday's crowded gathering place into today's center of power. It is easy to admire a castle when everything appears orderly. Far harder to imagine the countless hours required to make it look that way. And perhaps the greatest surprise is this. Medieval people cared about cleanliness far more than modern stereotypes often suggest. No, they did not have bleach, vacuum cleaners, or electric washing machines. But they were not simply content to live in filth. They understood that smoke damaged rooms, that rotting food attracted pests, that standing waste created foul smells, and that a neglected castle quickly became an unpleasant place to live. Their solutions were different. Sometimes ingenious, sometimes exhausting, sometimes downright strange. Over the next few hours, as the castle slowly comes to life around us, we'll follow the forgotten workers whose daily efforts kept these enormous stone fortresses functioning long before anyone had ever imagined electricity. Because behind every magnificent medieval castle was something history rarely celebrates: a broom, and the people who never stopped using it. If you have ever visited a medieval castle on a sunny afternoon, you have probably noticed how clean it seems. The stone walls are tidy. The great halls echo quietly beneath carefully restored wooden ceilings. The courtyards are swept. The air smells pleasantly of old timber and cool stone. It is easy to imagine that castles always looked this way. The reality was rather different. A medieval castle was not a museum. It was a living, breathing workplace. People were constantly arriving and leaving. Supplies moved in and out every day. Animals wandered through certain areas. Smoke drifted through open halls. Food was prepared from sunrise until late into the evening. Even if every servant worked tirelessly, dirt had an uncanny habit of returning almost as quickly as it disappeared. Perhaps the greatest enemy was something we rarely think about today: mud. Modern roads are far from perfect, but they are generally paved. Many medieval roads were little more than compacted earth. When it rained, those roads transformed into thick stretches of slippery mud. A traveler arriving after several days on horseback did not simply brush a little dust from his boots. He might arrive coated in layers of wet earth from head to toe. His horse looked little better. The wagon carrying barrels of ale or sacks of grain splashed through puddles deep enough to swallow entire wheels. Every journey brought part of the countryside directly into the castle. Imagine standing near the main gate on a rainy autumn afternoon. The drawbridge lowers with a heavy groan. A group of soldiers returns from patrol. Their cloaks are soaked. Their boots leave dark, muddy footprints across the entrance passage. Behind them come two wagons loaded with firewood. The horses shake rainwater from their manes. Clumps of mud fall from their hooves onto the stone ground. A merchant follows carrying baskets of vegetables freshly harvested from nearby fields. Not long after that, several hunting dogs race into the courtyard, splattering more mud as they chase each other between servants carrying supplies. Within minutes, the carefully swept entrance has become dirty again. Nobody complains. This is simply another ordinary day. And somewhere nearby, someone quietly reaches for a broom. Mud was only the beginning. Every castle relied on enormous fireplaces. Without them, winter life inside thick stone walls would have been miserable. Fire provided warmth, light, a place to cook meals, water for washing, comfort during long evenings. Yet every fire produced something else. Ash. Mountains of it. Each morning, before new logs could be added, yesterday's ashes needed to be removed. This sounds like a small task until you remember how many fireplaces existed inside a large castle. The Great Hall usually contained an enormous hearth. Private chambers often had their own fireplaces. Guest rooms needed warmth. The kitchens burned almost constantly. Guardrooms, workshops, and important offices frequently relied on fires as well. Each hearth became another source of dust and ash floating quietly through the building. Then there was smoke. Modern chimneys are remarkably efficient. Many medieval ones were not. Smoke rarely behaved exactly as people hoped. Sometimes it drifted upward. Sometimes it lingered stubbornly beneath wooden roofs. Sometimes a change in the wind pushed it back into the room. Over weeks and months, tiny black particles settled almost everywhere. Stone walls gradually darkened. Ceiling beams collected soot. Tapestries trapped smoke within their woven fibers. Curtains absorbed the smell. Even clothing could carry the scent long after someone had left the room. If you've ever sat beside a campfire and noticed your jacket still smelling of smoke the next morning, you've experienced only a tiny glimpse of what castle life could be like. Except imagine living inside that environment every single day and cleaning it. The kitchens created their own unique challenges. A medieval kitchen was one of the busiest places in the castle. Large cauldrons simmered for hours. Bread ovens remained hot throughout much of the day. Roasting spits turned steadily over open flames. Servants hurried between preparation tables carrying meat, vegetables, flour, herbs, and heavy pots. No matter how careful everyone tried to be, accidents happened constantly. Grease splashed onto floors. Flour drifted into the air like pale clouds. Vegetable scraps fell beneath tables. À l'espède. Water overflowed from buckets. A dropped bowl might shatter across the floor, leaving someone to gather every broken piece before another servant stepped on it. Cleaning the kitchen was never something that happened only after dinner. It happened continuously. One person prepared food. Another washed utensils. Someone swept. Someone else carried away waste. The work flowed in an endless cycle from dawn until long after sunset. Outside, the castle courtyard presented another problem altogether. Unlike today's paved shopping centers or office buildings, castle courtyards were working spaces. Blacksmiths hammered glowing iron. Carpenters sawed timber. Stable workers cared for horses. Wagons unloaded supplies. Children ran between buildings. Dogs searched hopefully for scraps of food. Chickens pecked at the ground. Occasionally, even pigs wandered where they probably shouldn't. Every activity produced waste. Wood shavings, animal droppings, bits of straw, broken rope, discarded packaging, spilled grain. Cleaning crews could hardly finish one section before another needed attention. And then there were the floors themselves. Many people imagine polished stone stretching across every room of a medieval castle. Some important areas certainly had beautiful stone paving, but not everywhere. Different rooms used different materials. Some had wooden floors. Others were packed earth. Some were covered with rushes. Rushes were long reeds or grasses spread across the floor. To modern ears, this might sound rather odd. Why deliberately cover your floor with plants? The answer was surprisingly practical. Rushes provided insulation against cold stone. They softened footsteps. They absorbed moisture. They trapped dust that might otherwise swirl into the air. Fresh herbs were sometimes mixed among them, adding pleasant scents that helped disguise less pleasant ones. Of course, rushes also collected crumbs, dirt, spilled drink, candle wax, and anything else dropped during the day. Eventually, they needed replacing. Imagine removing an entire floor covering made from dried plants after weeks of use. It was hardly a pleasant task, yet someone had to do it. Perhaps one of the most remarkable things about castle cleaning is that very little of it stayed clean for long. A servant might spend an hour sweeping a corridor, 5 minutes later, muddy boots crossed it. Fresh ashes drifted from a nearby fireplace. A gust of wind carried leaves through an open doorway. The work began again. There was no finish line, no moment when the castle sparkled from top to bottom. Instead, cleanliness was something constantly chased, but never completely caught. And perhaps that is why cleaning a medieval castle required far more than hard work. It required patience, the kind of patience that accepts the floor will become dirty again. The fire will produce more ash. More guests will arrive. More meals will be cooked. More mud will be carried indoors. Tomorrow morning, before the castle wakes, the broom will be waiting exactly where it was needed the day before. And the day before that. And the day before that. If there was one luxury that castle cleaners rarely enjoyed, it was sleeping in. Their day often began while nearly everyone else inside the castle was still wrapped in blankets, completely unaware that an entire workforce had already been awake for hours. Before the Lord could hold court, before breakfast could be served, and certainly before any visiting noble expected to stroll through spotless halls, the castle had to be transformed from the chaos of yesterday into something resembling order again. There were no bright electric lights to flick on, so servants navigated dim corridors using candles, lanterns, or the faint glow of dying embers from fireplaces that had burned through the night. In winter, those corridors could be painfully cold. Stone is an excellent material if you're trying to build a fortress that can survive a siege, but it is far less enjoyable when you're carrying heavy buckets of freezing water before sunrise. Even today, anyone who has reluctantly climbed out of a warm bed on a cold morning knows the feeling. Medieval servants simply had the added bonus of doing it while hauling enough water to fill half the castle. One of the very first tasks was checking the fireplaces. A castle without warm fires quickly became uncomfortable, especially during the long European winters. The fires that had kept everyone warm the previous evening had mostly burned themselves into piles of gray ash by morning. Before fresh wood could be added, every fireplace needed to be cleaned out, and this was far messier than it sounds. Fine ash floated into the air with the slightest movement, covering clothes, hands, and sometimes faces before breakfast had even begun. It had a remarkable talent for finding its way into noses, eyes, and probably the servant's morning mood as well. Once the old ash had been removed, fresh logs were carefully stacked, embers were coaxed back to life, and the slow process of warming enormous stone rooms began all over again. Since castles often contained dozens of fireplaces, this wasn't one quick job, but a carefully repeated routine that could take hours. While the fires were being revived, other servants had already begun carrying water. This may not sound especially impressive until you remember that water did not arrive through pipes hidden inside the walls. Every bucket had to be fetched manually from wells, springs, or nearby rivers, sometimes over surprisingly long distances. A large castle could require hundreds of gallons of water every single day for cooking, washing, brewing, cleaning, and caring for animals. Buckets were heavy when full, awkward to carry, and somehow always seemed to become even heavier halfway across the courtyard. Historians rarely record how many times servants quietly wish someone would invent indoor plumbing a few centuries early, but one suspects the thought must have crossed a few minds. Only after the fires and water were taken care of could the real cleaning begin. Brooms made from bundles of birch twigs or tightly bound rushes scraped across stone floors with a steady rhythm that probably became the unofficial soundtrack of castle mornings. Unlike a modern vacuum cleaner that politely traps dust inside a bag, these brooms mostly persuaded the dirt to move somewhere else before it was collected. Dust rose into the air, settled on nearby furniture, and occasionally drifted straight back onto the floor as if determined to undo the previous 10 minutes of hard work. The servants were engaged in an endless battle against a very stubborn opponent, and the opponent usually had home field advantage. The Great Hall demanded particular attention. This enormous room was the heart of castle life, serving as dining room, courtroom, reception hall, meeting place, and sometimes even a sleeping area for members of the household. If a feast had taken place the previous evening, The hall could resemble the aftermath of a very enthusiastic celebration. Bones from roasted meats, stale bread, spilled ale, candle wax, bits of fruit, nutshells, and rushes flattened beneath hundreds of muddy boots all had to disappear before breakfast preparations began. Dogs, who happily wander beneath the tables during meals, collecting whatever generous diners accidentally or deliberately dropped, certainly helped with some of the leftovers, though their cleaning methods would not meet modern hygiene standards. They were enthusiastic assistants, but perhaps not the most thorough. By the time the first rays of sunlight finally crept through the narrow castle windows, much of this work had already been completed. Noble families stepping into freshly swept halls often saw only the finished result, not the army of servants who had spent hours making it possible. It is one of those quiet ironies of history that the better these workers performed their jobs, the less anyone noticed they had done anything at all. A perfectly clean hall attracted little attention. A dirty one, on the other hand, would have been impossible to ignore. If there was one room that truly tested the patience of medieval cleaners, it was the Great Hall. This was the beating heart of the castle, the place where almost everything important happened. The Lord held court here, guests were welcomed here, feasts were celebrated here, important announcements were made here, and on cold evenings it became the warmest room in the entire castle. A grand feast might look magnificent in paintings, with long wooden tables overflowing with roasted meats, fresh bread, fruit, pies, silver goblets, and colorful banners hanging proudly from the rafters. What paintings almost never show is what the hall looked like an hour after everyone had left. Modern dinner parties usually end with a few plates in the sink and perhaps a wine stain on the tablecloth. Medieval feasts were considerably more enthusiastic. Hundreds of people could eat together, especially during festivals or celebrations, and table manners were rather different from what we might expect today. Guests often ate with their fingers, shared serving dishes with the people beside them, and tossed unwanted bones beneath the tables, where an eager collection of dogs patiently waited for dinner to arrive from above. These dogs were remarkably efficient at cleaning up scraps of meat, though they were somewhat less helpful when it came to puddles of ale, melted candle wax, or greasy stains spread across the floor. One suspects they considered those someone else's responsibility. The floors themselves presented another challenge. Many great halls were covered with fresh rushes, long reeds scattered across the floor that helped insulate against the cold stone beneath. They also made walking slightly more comfortable and absorbed spills before they spread everywhere. At least, that was the theory. After a large feast, those rushes had absorbed far more than anyone would have wanted. Ale, wine, gravy, bits of bread, vegetable peelings, candle wax, muddy footprints, and whatever happened to fall from the tables throughout the evening all settled into the thick layer underfoot. By morning, the once fresh rushes had become something no servant looked forward to handling. Removing them meant gathering armfuls of damp, dirty plant material that had quietly collected an entire evening's worth of medieval hospitality. The tables themselves demanded just as much attention. Unlike modern dining tables finished with protective varnish and cleaned with a quick spray of polish, medieval tables were solid wooden planks that absorbed years of use. Servants scraped away dried food, wiped away grease with damp cloths, collected wooden trenchers, goblets, knives, and serving dishes, and carefully checked that nothing valuable had accidentally been left behind. A silver cup forgotten beneath a bench was not simply an inconvenience. It represented a very expensive mistake. Castles employed numerous servants, and while most were honest, valuable objects had an unfortunate habit of disappearing if nobody was paying attention. Cleaning, therefore, involved not only removing dirt, but also accounting for everything that belonged to the household. Candles created yet another unexpected problem. A grand feast could require dozens, sometimes even hundreds, of candles to illuminate the enormous hall once darkness fell. They filled the room with a warm, golden glow that must have looked spectacular reflected from polished goblets and richly colored tapestries. Unfortunately, candles have a habit of dripping. Melted wax landed on tables, benches, floors, and occasionally on unfortunate guests who happened to sit beneath particularly enthusiastic candle holders. Removing hardened wax without damaging wooden furniture required patience and careful scraping. It was slow work, and considering how many candles medieval households burned every evening, it was work that never truly ended. Then there was the smell. Imagine entering the Great Hall on the morning after a lavish banquet. The air would still carry traces of roasted meat, wood smoke, spilled ale, damp rushes, extinguished candles, and the lingering scent of several hundred people who had spent hours eating, drinking, laughing, and talking together. It was probably not unbearable, but it certainly wasn't the fresh mountain breeze that modern castle visitors sometimes imagine. Opening shutters helped when the weather allowed, though in the middle of winter that also invited freezing air inside, forcing servants to choose between fresh air and warm fingers. Like many aspects of medieval life, cleaning often meant deciding which inconvenience was slightly less unpleasant. And yet, by the time the Lord and his guests gathered for the next meal, much of yesterday's chaos had vanished as though it had never existed. Fresh rushes covered the floor, tables stood neatly arranged, candles had been replaced, goblets polished, and the hall was once again ready to impress whoever walked through its doors. Visitors admired the grandeur of the castle, complimented the hospitality of its owner, and marveled at the magnificent surroundings. Very few paused to think about the dozens of exhausted servants who had quietly erased every trace of the previous night's celebration before most people had even opened their eyes. If mud was the castle's greatest enemy outside, then smoke was its greatest enemy indoors. It is almost impossible to imagine a medieval castle without fire. Every season, every meal, and nearly every room depended on it. Fire warmed the great hall during bitter winters, roasted meat in the kitchens, heated water for washing, illuminated dark chambers after sunset, and provided comfort on evenings when icy winds rattled the shutters. It was the closest thing medieval people had to electricity, central heating, and a modern kitchen combined. But fire always demanded payment, and it usually collected that payment in smoke, soot, and ash. Walk into a modern home after someone has accidentally burned a piece of toast, and you'll probably notice the smell for an hour or two. In a medieval castle, smoke was simply part of everyday life. Even castles with well-designed chimneys struggled to remove it completely. The larger the fire, the more smoke it produced, and the larger the castle, the more fires burned at the same time. Great fireplaces could consume enormous quantities of wood every day, especially during winter, when some blazed almost continuously from dawn until bedtime. Tiny particles of soot floated through the air before settling onto walls, beams, furniture, tapestries, and just about anything else that remained still long enough. Cleaning this soot was an exhausting task because it never truly stopped accumulating. Imagine carefully wiping down a wooden table, only for a fresh layer of fine black dust to begin settling on it before the day is over. Ceiling beams were particularly troublesome. Many castles featured magnificent timber roofs stretching high above the Great Hall, supported by thick wooden beams that looked impressive from below but were awkward to reach. Over the years, they slowly darkened as smoke coated every surface. Modern visitors often admire those ancient blackened beams, assuming they were stained intentionally. In many cases, what they're actually seeing is centuries of smoke quietly leaving its mark on the wood. The walls suffered as well. Although many castle interiors were decorated with colorful wall paintings or expensive tapestries, smoke had little respect for artistic achievement. Painted plaster gradually dulled beneath layers of soot, while woven fabrics trapped both smoke and dust deep within their fibers. Tapestries were especially valuable because they helped insulate cold stone walls, making rooms noticeably warmer during winter. Removing them for cleaning, however, was a substantial undertaking. Some were enormous, weighing far more than a single servant could comfortably manage. Once taken down, they needed careful brushing and airing, sometimes outdoors when the weather cooperated. It was hardly practical to do this every week, so even wealthy castles accepted that a certain amount of smoke was simply part of life. The kitchens presented an even greater challenge. Here, the fires burned hotter, longer, and almost without interruption. Massive cauldrons hung above open flames. Spits slowly turned roasting animals throughout the day, and bread ovens remained warm for hours after baking. By the end of a busy week, almost every surface carried some evidence of smoke or grease. Ceiling timbers developed a sticky coating where soot mixed with cooking fats, creating a stubborn layer that was considerably more difficult to remove than ordinary dust. Kitchen servants likely became so accustomed to the smell that they barely noticed it anymore, though anyone entering from outside would probably have recognized it immediately. Perhaps the hardest objects to keep clean were metal cooking pots. A shiny new iron pot placed over an open fire quickly developed a thick black coating underneath. Medieval cooks expected this, but someone still had to scrub those pots afterward. Without modern steel wool or commercial cleaning products, servants relied on surprisingly simple methods. Sand acted as a natural abrasive, while bundles of rough straw or coarse cloth helped scrape away stubborn residue. It was effective, but it required plenty of elbow grease, a phrase that medieval cleaners would have understood all too well, even if they never used those exact words. Then there was the simple matter of breathing. Living around open fires every day meant constantly inhaling smoke, ash, and tiny particles drifting through the air. Chroniclers rarely stopped to complain about smoky rooms because they were so ordinary. Yet modern researchers believe indoor air quality in many medieval buildings could be surprisingly poor, especially during winter when doors and shutters remained closed to keep precious warmth inside. Imagine spending 10 or 12 hours each day tending fireplaces, cooking over open flames, sweeping ashes, and carrying firewood. By evening, your clothes smelled of smoke, your hands were blackened with soot, and your hair probably carried the scent of the hearth no matter how thoroughly you washed it. Yet despite all this, servants continued their work with remarkable consistency. Every morning they emptied ashes, wiped soot from surfaces, cleaned fireplaces, stacked fresh wood, and prepared to repeat exactly the same routine the following day. It was a battle they could never completely win, only manage. The castle would never remain spotless for long because the very fires that made life inside possible were constantly creating new work. In a strange way, the castle was fighting against itself. The warmth everyone depended upon was also the source of one of the cleaners' greatest headaches, ensuring that no matter how diligently they worked today, tomorrow morning another thin layer of soot would already be waiting for them. When people imagine a medieval castle, they often picture the sights: towering stone walls, colorful banners fluttering in the wind, knights in shining armor, and enormous banquet tables piled high with roasted meats. Some imagine the sounds as well: the crackling of fireplaces, the ringing of blacksmiths' hammers, or the cheerful music of wandering minstrels. But there is one part of castle life that is almost always missing from our imagination, perhaps because it is impossible to experience while looking at old paintings or restored ruins: the smell. If someone could travel back in time and step inside a busy medieval castle, it is entirely possible that the very first thing they noticed would not be what they saw, but what they smelled. To be fair, castles did not constantly stink in the dramatic way films sometimes suggest. Medieval people were perfectly capable of recognizing unpleasant odors, and they generally disliked them just as much as we do. Nobody enjoyed living beside rotting food or breathing foul air if they could avoid it. The difference was that they faced challenges we rarely encounter today, and many of the smells they considered ordinary would probably seem overwhelming to modern visitors. A castle was not simply a luxurious residence. It was also a military fortress, a workplace, a busy household, a warehouse, a stable, and sometimes a temporary home for hundreds of people all living together within thick stone walls. The largest contributor was almost certainly smoke. As we have already discovered, fireplaces burned throughout the day and often long into the night. Their warmth made castle life possible, especially during harsh winters, but the smell of burning would become woven into daily existence. Clothes absorbed it, blankets absorbed it, curtains absorbed it, Even people's hair probably carried traces of smoke wherever they went. If you've ever returned home after spending an evening around a campfire and discovered the smell lingering on your jacket the next morning, you already have some idea of what castle life was like. Now imagine never really escaping that scent, because nearly every building you entered contained another open fire. The kitchens added another layer to the castle's unique perfume. Meals were prepared on a remarkable scale, especially in the homes of wealthy nobles. Entire animals roasted over open flames, enormous pots of stew simmered for hours, loaves of bread baked in great ovens, fish was salted, herbs were chopped, onions peeled, garlic crushed, and cheeses stored in cool rooms nearby. To modern noses, some of these smells would have been delicious, others perhaps a little less so. The combined aroma of roasting meat with smoke, hot fat, fresh herbs, damp stone, and several dozen hardworking cooks must have created an atmosphere unlike anything found in a modern kitchen. Then there were the animals. Horses were essential to medieval life, and almost every castle maintained stables within or beside its walls. Dogs wandered freely through many parts of the household, partly because they were useful for hunting, guarding, and enthusiastically cleaning up dropped scraps during meals. Cats earned their keep by hunting the mice that inevitably found their way into grain stores and kitchens. Chickens scratched around courtyards. Geese loudly announced the arrival of visitors whether anyone wanted the announcement or not, and livestock sometimes spent time surprisingly close to human living spaces. Medieval people accepted this as perfectly normal. Modern visitors might need a few hours to adjust. Even the building itself had its own scent. Stone walls trapped moisture remarkably well, especially during wet seasons. Many rooms received little direct sunlight, allowing dampness to linger in corners and along lower walls. Wooden beams creaked gently as they absorbed and released moisture throughout the year, while tapestries and heavy curtains collected years of smoke, dust, and everyday life within their woven fibers. None of these smells necessarily indicated poor cleanliness. They were simply the natural result of living inside a massive stone structure long before modern ventilation systems existed. Castle cleaners fought these odors in surprisingly clever ways. Fresh rushes spread across floors were often mixed with fragrant herbs such as lavender, rosemary, mint, chamomile, or sweet woodruff. As people walked across the room, these herbs released gentle scents into the air, helping to freshen spaces that had hosted large gatherings the previous evening. Windows and shutters were opened whenever the weather allowed, letting fresh air drift through the halls, though this solution became rather less appealing during the depths of winter when every open window also invited an enthusiastic blast of freezing wind. Some rooms were fumigated using pleasant-smelling herbs or aromatic woods burned slowly over embers, an early attempt at something resembling an air freshener, albeit one involving considerably more smoke. Perhaps the most difficult challenge came from the castle's toilets, politely known as garderobes. Although they represented an impressive piece of medieval engineering, they still required regular attention, and no amount of rosemary could completely disguise their purpose. Fortunately, for today's listeners, we shall save that particularly fascinating subject for our next stop. As it turns out, keeping a medieval castle clean did not simply involve sweeping floors and emptying fireplaces. Someone also had to deal with what everyone else preferred not to think about, proving once again that the least glamorous jobs were often the most essential. For many people, no discussion about medieval castles feels complete without mentioning the toilets. They have acquired an almost legendary reputation over the centuries, usually accompanied by stories that are either wildly exaggerated or completely invented. Some imagine castles as places where waste simply piled up in dark corners, while others picture impossibly filthy conditions that no sensible person could tolerate for more than a few minutes. As with so many aspects of medieval history, the truth lies somewhere in between. Castle toilets were certainly nothing like the comfortable bathrooms we enjoy today, but they were also rather more sophisticated than many people give them credit for. The medieval toilet was commonly known as a garderobe, and despite the rather elegant name, Its purpose was exactly what you think it was. In many castles, it consisted of a small stone chamber built into the thickness of an exterior wall. At first glance, it might resemble a tiny private room with a narrow window allowing in a little fresh air. Hidden beneath a simple wooden seat was a vertical stone shaft running down through the wall of the castle. Gravity, one of history's most reliable inventions, did most of the work. Waste fell through the shaft into a pit below, or, in some fortunate castles, directly into a river, moat, or fast-moving stream. It was a surprisingly clever design for a period without plumbing, and many examples still survive today. Of course, building the toilet was only half the challenge. Someone eventually had to deal with everything that happened afterward. Depending on the castle's design, waste pits needed regular emptying. And while medieval chroniclers had an unfortunate habit of ignoring the people who performed such tasks, we know these workers certainly existed. It was difficult, unpleasant work that rarely earned admiration, yet it was absolutely essential for keeping a large household functioning. A castle with several hundred residents could not simply pretend such problems would solve themselves. Medieval society depended upon countless invisible workers whose efforts allowed everyone else to think about more glamorous matters, and toilet cleaning ranked very high on that rather unfortunate list. Even inside the garderobe itself, cleaning was a constant necessity. Wooden seats had to be wiped down, floors swept, and the small chambers kept as hygienic as circumstances allowed. Fresh straw or herbs might occasionally be placed nearby to improve the smell, while the narrow windows helped carry unpleasant air outside whenever there was a breeze. In truth, medieval architects understood ventilation better than we sometimes assume. Positioning garderobes along exterior walls was no accident. The movement of air through the shafts naturally helped reduce odors inside the castle, an early example of practical engineering solving a very human problem. One of the more curious facts about garderobes is that they may have served a second purpose entirely unrelated to toilets. The name itself comes from the French words meaning to guard clothing. Historians believe some people stored valuable garments near these small rooms because fleas and other insects disliked the constant airflow and the strong smell of ammonia rising from below. It sounds rather strange to modern ears, but medieval people were often remarkably practical. If hanging an expensive cloak near the toilet helped protect it from pests, then that was considered a perfectly sensible solution. It is one of those delightful little historical details that reminds us people in the past approached everyday problems with a creativity born from necessity rather than convenience. Not every castle handled waste in exactly the same way. Larger and wealthier castles often featured multiple garderobes scattered throughout different towers and residential areas, allowing noble families, guests, and servants to use separate facilities. Some castles positioned them directly above cliffs or rivers where nature carried waste away with admirable efficiency. Others relied on cesspits that required regular maintenance. Archaeologists studying these pits today have discovered extraordinary treasures hidden among the less glamorous contents. Seeds, fruit stones, fragments of leather shoes, broken combs, lost rings, discarded gaming pieces, and even tiny remnants of meals have survived for centuries because they were accidentally dropped or deliberately thrown away. It is perhaps one of archaeology's greatest ironies that some of our best evidence for medieval daily life comes from places where nobody ever intended to leave history behind. Cleaning these areas required more than a strong stomach. It demanded consistency. Left unattended, insects would multiply, unpleasant smells would spread, and disease could become a serious concern. Medieval people did not understand bacteria in the modern scientific sense, but they certainly understood that filth attracted problems. A clean household was more pleasant, more respectable, and often healthier than a neglected one. The servants responsible for maintaining the castle's toilets may never have received praise from their employers, but their work quietly protected everyone living within those thick stone walls. It is easy to laugh about medieval toilets from the comfort of the 21st century, especially when modern plumbing hides almost every unpleasant part of the process behind the simple push of a button. Yet if there's one thing history teaches us, it is that every society, no matter how grand its castles or powerful its kings, has always depended upon ordinary people willing to perform the jobs that everyone else would rather avoid. In medieval castles, few jobs fit that description better than keeping the garderobes clean, and as uncomfortable as the work must have been, the entire household benefited from the quiet dedication of the people who did it every single day. If you thought sweeping endless corridors or scrubbing soot from fireplaces sounded exhausting, then you might be relieved to learn that someone else had the job of washing the laundry. Unfortunately for that someone else, laundry in a medieval castle was less of a household chore and more of a full-scale operation. Today, washing clothes is often little more than sorting garments into the correct pile, adding detergent, pressing a few buttons, and returning an hour later. Medieval servants would probably have considered that the closest thing to magic. Every shirt, blanket, tablecloth, towel, curtain, and bedsheet had to be cleaned almost entirely by hand, and in a large castle there seemed to be an endless supply of all of them. A wealthy household owned an astonishing amount of fabric. Noble families changed into different clothes throughout the day, depending on the occasion, while servants wore practical garments that became dirty remarkably quickly. Beds required linen sheets and wool blankets. Tables in important rooms were covered with cloths during meals. Kitchens relied on towels, cloths, and aprons. Religious services needed carefully maintained altar linens, while guests expected clean bedding whenever they stayed overnight. Every piece eventually became stained with mud, smoke, sweat, grease, ash, or simple everyday use. Unlike modern wardrobes filled with inexpensive machine-made clothing, many medieval textiles were expensive to produce, making proper care incredibly important. Replacing a damaged linen sheet was far more costly than simply washing it carefully. The process usually began with water, and, as we have already discovered, obtaining water was a task in itself. Wells, rivers, or nearby springs supplied what was needed, but every bucket had to be carried by hand. Large washing days demanded enormous quantities of water, enough that several servants might spend hours doing nothing but transporting it. Heating the water required even more work. Huge cauldrons were placed over open fires until the water became warm enough for washing, though not every fabric appreciated boiling temperatures. Someone had to keep those fires burning while someone else prepared the garments waiting to be cleaned. Without modern soaps, medieval people relied on materials that sound unusual today but proved surprisingly effective. Lye, produced from wood ash mixed with water, acted as a powerful cleaning agent. Soap made from animal fat and ash had existed for centuries, although its quality varied considerably depending on who made it. For delicate fabrics, gentler methods were often preferred. Stains might be treated with vinegar, while fuller's earth, a special type of clay, was sometimes used to absorb grease from wool. None of these methods smelled particularly pleasant during the process, but they achieved something remarkably important. They worked. Medieval people may not have possessed brightly colored bottles promising extra freshness, but they certainly understood the value of removing dirt from valuable clothing. The actual washing demanded serious physical effort. Clothes were soaked, scrubbed, beaten, wrung out, rinsed, and scrubbed again if necessary. Thick wool garments became astonishingly heavy once they absorbed water. Lifting a soaked blanket was less like picking up bedding and more like wrestling with a reluctant sheep that had somehow learned to impersonate a sponge. Linen was easier to handle, but required careful treatment to avoid damage. Every piece represented hours of spinning, weaving, sewing, and often costly materials. Tearing an expensive garment through careless washing was not the sort of mistake that made employers particularly cheerful. Drying the laundry created its own challenges. During warm summer weather, clothes could be hung outdoors where sunshine and fresh air helped speed the process. Unfortunately, medieval Europe experienced rather more than its fair share of rain. During wet seasons or freezing winters, drying fabrics became frustratingly slow. Garments might be hung near fireplaces, stretched across lines inside large rooms, or draped wherever there was enough warmth to encourage the moisture to disappear. Imagine walking through parts of the castle only to find shirts, towels, and blankets hanging everywhere like an unusually organized forest of fabric. It may not have looked elegant, but necessity rarely concerns itself with appearances. Then came the ironing. Although medieval irons bore little resemblance to the lightweight electric versions sitting in modern cupboards. Heavy metal irons were heated directly over the fire before being pressed on a fabric. The challenge, of course, was finding the perfect temperature. Too cool, and they achieved very little. Too hot, and an expensive linen shirt might suddenly acquire an unfortunate scorch mark that no amount of explanation could remove. Experienced servants developed a remarkable instinct for judging heat, often testing the iron carefully before allowing it anywhere near valuable clothing. It was a skill learned through experience, and perhaps, occasionally, through mistakes that were remembered far longer than anyone would have preferred. Some fabrics were simply too valuable to trust to everyday handling. Richly embroidered garments decorated with silk threads, gold embroidery, or expensive dyes required exceptional care. Certain dyes faded quickly if washed too aggressively, while delicate stitching could unravel under rough treatment. The clothing of nobles, therefore, demanded almost as much attention as the nobles themselves. Keeping these garments clean was not merely about appearance. It reflected the status and dignity of the entire household. A lord arriving at court wearing stained or poorly maintained clothing would hardly inspire confidence, and no respectable castle wished to earn such a reputation. By the end of a washing day, servants were likely soaked, tired, and thoroughly familiar with the weight of wet fabric. Yet the satisfaction of seeing rows of freshly cleaned linen drying in the breeze must have been considerable. It represented another invisible victory over the endless mess of castle life. Tomorrow, of course, someone would spill ale on a tablecloth, track mud across freshly washed garments, or return from a hunt looking as though they had personally challenged every puddle in the forest. The laundry would begin accumulating once again, patiently waiting for the next washing day, because in a medieval castle, just like the sweeping, the fires, and the endless battle against dust, clean clothes were never a final achievement. They were simply part of a cycle that never truly ended. By the time most visitors entered a medieval castle, they would probably assume that every room was cleaned in much the same way. A floor was swept, furniture was dusted, the fire was tended, and the work was done. In reality, not all rooms were created equal. There was one part of the castle where even the most experienced servants worked with a little extra care, spoke a little more quietly, and thought twice before moving so much as a single chair. These were the private chambers of the lord and his family, the closest thing a medieval castle had to a personal home within what was otherwise a bustling fortress. Cleaning these rooms required far more than hard work. It required trust. Unlike the Great Hall, where hundreds of people came and went every day, the lord's private apartments were among the most restricted spaces in the castle. Access was carefully controlled, and only a small number of trusted servants were permitted to enter without permission. This was not simply because the lord valued his privacy, although he certainly did. These rooms often contained some of the household's most valuable possessions. Chests filled with important documents, expensive clothing, jewelry, finely crafted furniture, religious objects, family heirlooms, and occasionally even money were kept within these chambers. A careless cleaner could accidentally damage something priceless. A dishonest one could make it disappear altogether. For that reason, servants assigned to these rooms were often chosen as much for their reputation as for their ability to clean. The work itself demanded remarkable attention to detail. Heavy curtains were shaken free of dust, though doing so often released a cloud that made it seem as though the curtains had been secretly storing half the castle's soot for safekeeping. Wooden furniture was wiped clean with soft cloths, taking care not to scratch polished surfaces that had taken craftsmen weeks to produce. Chests and cupboards were cleaned around rather than casually rearranged. Even moving an object unnecessarily could create confusion later if the Lord expected to find it exactly where he had left it. Imagine tidying someone's desk today without asking, only to hear them spend the next hour wondering where their papers had gone. Now, imagine that person also happened to control an army. The bed naturally became one of the most important parts of the room. Medieval beds were surprisingly expensive pieces of furniture, often passed down through generations. The grand four-poster frames that survive in museums today represented a significant investment, but the true luxury lay in what covered them. Thick feather mattresses, linen sheets, embroidered blankets, wool coverings, and richly decorated curtains all required regular care. Bedding was aired whenever possible to reduce dampness and freshen the fabric, while sheets and blankets were changed according to the standards of the household. Contrary to popular myth, medieval nobles did not simply sleep in the same dirty bedding forever. Clean linen was considered a mark of comfort and status, even if changing it required considerably more effort than stripping a modern duvet. Dust proved to be an especially stubborn visitor in these rooms. Thick curtains, carved furniture, shelves, window ledges, and decorative objects all collected fine layers of soot drifting from nearby fireplaces. Servants carefully brushed and wiped these surfaces, knowing that the smallest neglected corner would become painfully obvious whenever sunlight streamed through the windows. Ironically, the more luxurious a room became, the more things it contained that needed cleaning. Every carved chair added another surface for dust to settle upon. Every tapestry trapped another layer of smoke. Every decorative chest, shelf, or cabinet quietly increased the day's workload. The fireplaces demanded their usual attention as well. Ashes were removed, fresh logs prepared, and hearths swept clean before the room's occupants returned. In wealthier castles, servants often ensured that the fire was already burning before the lord entered his chamber on a cold evening. It was a small gesture that transformed an icy stone room into a welcoming retreat, though it also meant someone had risen earlier to make it happen. Medieval comfort, much like modern comfort, usually depended on another person's effort. One aspect of the job required qualities that no broom or bucket could provide: discretion. Servants working in private chambers inevitably witnessed parts of noble life that outsiders never saw. They might notice letters lying open on a table, hear quiet conversations through half-open doors, or discover evidence of family disagreements that would never appear in official chronicles. A wise servant understood that silence could be as valuable as hard work. Gossip about a lord's private affairs could spread remarkably quickly through a household, and employers naturally preferred servants who kept their observations to themselves. In many ways, cleaning these chambers made a servant an invisible witness to history, present for countless ordinary moments that historians would never record. It is perhaps fitting that the cleanest rooms in the castle were also the quietest. While the great hall echoed with conversation and the kitchens bustled with constant activity, the private chambers offered a rare sense of calm. Here, the work was slower, more careful, and almost respectful in its rhythm. Every blanket straightened, every candle replaced, every window opened for fresh air contributed to an environment where the lord and his family could briefly escape the noise of castle life. They may never have paused to thank the people responsible, but every comfortable evening spent beside a warm fire in a tidy chamber was built upon hours of invisible labor performed long before they arrived. If castle cleaning was difficult during the warmth of summer, winter transformed it into something that bordered on endurance test. Modern homes are built to keep us comfortable. We adjust the thermostat, close the windows, and rarely think much about the weather once we're indoors. A medieval castle, despite its thick defensive walls, was a very different place. Those same stone walls that protected people from invading armies also had an unfortunate habit of trapping the cold. They absorbed the chill throughout the night and seemed determined to share it with everyone inside long after sunrise. Even with roaring fireplaces, many rooms remained cold enough for people to see their own breath, and the servants responsible for cleaning them had little choice but to get on with the job. The morning usually began in darkness. Winter days were short, and sunrise arrived late, meaning much of the early work was carried out by the light of candles, or flickering lanterns. Shadows stretched along the corridors, making enormous halls feel even larger than they really were. Sweeping stone floors in poor light was hardly ideal, but waiting for daylight was not an option. The castle had to be ready before its residents awoke, regardless of whether the sun had decided to make an appearance. There's something rather admirable about that quiet determination. While everyone else remained tucked beneath heavy blankets, servants were already pushing open stiff wooden doors, their footsteps echoing through halls that had scarcely warmed since the previous evening. Water became one of winter's greatest frustrations. Every task seemed to require it. Floors needed washing, laundry demanded it in astonishing quantities, cooking depended on it, and people still expected water for washing themselves, however reluctantly. Yet obtaining that water could be far more difficult than during warmer months. Wells sometimes froze around the edges, buckets developed a thin layer of ice before reaching their destination, and water left standing indoors quickly became painfully cold. Carrying full buckets across slippery courtyards while trying not to spill a single drop must have required a balance worthy of an acrobat. One imagines there were mornings when a servant reached the kitchen only to discover that half the water had splashed onto their boots, leaving them to spend the rest of the day with freezing feet. The fireplaces, already demanding enough in autumn, became absolutely essential during winter. Fires had to be lit earlier, fed more frequently, and maintained throughout much of the day. This naturally produced even greater amounts of ash and soot, which meant even more cleaning. It was a curious cycle. The colder the weather became, the more fires people needed. The more fires they burned, the more smoke filled the castle. The more smoke filled the castle, the more work fell upon the cleaners. Winter did not simply increase one task. It quietly multiplied almost every task at once. Drying anything also became an exercise in patience. Freshly washed clothes hung near fireplaces for days instead of hours, while damp blankets and linens occupied every available space where a little warmth could be found. Servants had to be careful not to place fabrics too close to open flames, where a moment's carelessness could quickly become a very expensive fire. Too far away, however, and the clothes remained stubbornly damp. It was a delicate balancing act that required constant attention. Modern tumble dryers may not seem particularly exciting, but after imagining a medieval laundry room in January, they suddenly deserve a little more appreciation. Even a simple act of sweeping became harder during winter. Mud remained a constant companion. Only now it arrived, mixed with melting snow, wet leaves, and whatever the weather had decided to throw across the countryside. Every visitor entering the castle carried the season indoors on their boots. Corridors that had been carefully swept an hour earlier quickly filled with fresh footprints, puddles, and clumps of frozen earth. It must have felt at times as though the castle itself was quietly conspiring against the people trying to keep it clean. No sooner had one area been finished than another demanded attention. Yet perhaps the greatest challenge was simply the cold itself. Cleaning is physical work. It involves bending, lifting, carrying, scrubbing, and walking considerable distances. In winter, every one of those movements had to be performed while fingers stiffened in the freezing air and icy drafts slipped through narrow windows, under doors, and along the endless corridors. Gloves, if worn at all, were thick enough to provide warmth, but often clumsy for delicate tasks. Bare hands offered better control, but quickly became numb. Medieval servants rarely had the luxury of choosing comfort over necessity. And still, somehow, the work continued. Fires were lit, floors were swept, ashes disappeared, water was carried, laundry dried slowly beside the hearth. By the time the Lord descended for breakfast, the castle appeared warm, orderly, and ready for another day. It is one of history's quiet miracles that so much invisible labor could take place before most people had even rubbed the sleep from their eyes. Winter may have been the cleaners' greatest enemy, but it never defeated them. They simply rose a little earlier, worked a little harder, and trusted that spring would eventually return, bringing with it fresh problems, certainly, but at least slightly warmer fingers. After spending so much time following the castle's cleaners through smoky halls, muddy courtyards, overflowing laundries, and endless fireplaces, you might be wondering about the obvious question. Did any of this actually work? If we stepped inside a well-managed medieval castle on an ordinary afternoon, would we think it was clean, or would we immediately start looking for the nearest exit? The honest answer is both yes and no, depending entirely on whose standards you choose to use. By 21st century expectations, medieval castles would almost certainly feel dirty. There were no disinfectants, no antibacterial sprays, no vacuum cleaners humming across carpets, and certainly no automatic air fresheners quietly releasing the scent of alpine forests every 15 minutes. Dust settled more quickly, smoke lingered in the air, and animals were far closer to daily life than most of us would be comfortable with. A modern visitor would probably notice the smell of wood smoke almost immediately, followed by the uneven stone floors, the cool dampness of the walls, and perhaps the occasional dog wandering confidently through the great hall as though it owned the place. But judging medieval life by modern standards is a little like criticizing a sailing ship for not having Wi-Fi. It misses the point entirely. The people who live in castles were working with the knowledge and technology available to them, and by those standards, many castles were maintained remarkably well. Noble households invested significant money in servants whose sole purpose was to keep the residence orderly. Floors were swept daily, bedding was aired, clothes were washed, waste was removed, fireplaces were cleaned, fresh rushes were laid across the floors. Water was carried wherever it was needed. None of this happened by accident. It happened because cleanliness mattered. One of the biggest misconceptions about the Middle Ages is that people simply accepted filth as an unavoidable part of life. They did not. Medieval writers frequently complained about bad smells, dirty streets, and neglected buildings, which tells us something rather important. People only complain about dirt when they expect things to be cleaner. Kings issued laws about waste disposal in towns. Monasteries established strict routines for washing and housekeeping. Wealthy households employed servants specifically to maintain hygiene and order. Even ordinary families made considerable efforts to keep their homes as clean as their circumstances allowed. They may not have understood bacteria or viruses in the scientific way we do today, but they certainly understood that clean surroundings were more pleasant than dirty ones. Of course, there were limits to what could be achieved. Imagine trying to keep a modern house perfectly spotless while someone constantly tracked mud through the front door, another person burned logs in the living room all day, several dogs wandered freely between the furniture, and every glass window was open whenever the weather allowed. You might manage it for an hour or two before giving up entirely. Medieval castle cleaners never had the luxury of giving up. The mess returned every single day, and so did they. Perhaps the greatest compliment we can pay these forgotten workers is this. When they did their jobs well, nobody noticed them. Visitors admired the impressive architecture instead of the freshly swept floors. Guests praised the hospitality of the household rather than the servants who had spent hours preparing their rooms. Lords entertained powerful visitors beneath clean tapestries without stopping to think about the people who had carefully brushed away weeks of soot. Success in cleaning has always been strangely invisible. The better it is done, the less anyone thinks about the effort behind it. Archaeologists have occasionally discovered surprisingly clean layers inside medieval castles, evidence that rubbish was regularly removed rather than simply allowed to accumulate. They have found drains designed to carry away rainwater, carefully constructed kitchens arranged for efficient work, and storage rooms organized with remarkable attention to detail. These discoveries remind us that castles were not chaotic piles of stone inhabited by people who had abandoned all concern for cleanliness. They were carefully managed households, some of them as complex as small towns, requiring constant organization to function successfully. In many ways, the cleaners were among the most important people in the entire castle, even though history almost never remembers their names. Without them, fireplaces would clog with ash, kitchens would become unsafe, waste would accumulate, valuable clothing would deteriorate, and the magnificent halls where kings entertained their guests would quickly lose much of their grandeur. Every impressive castle depended just as much on the person holding the broom as it did on the knight carrying the sword. One simply received far more attention from historians than the other. The next time you visit a medieval castle, pause for a moment before admiring the towers or imagining the battles fought beneath its walls. Instead, look down at the stone floor. Picture a servant sweeping that very spot 700 years ago before dawn, carrying a simple birch broom worn smooth from years of use. Imagine another servant dragging buckets of water through the courtyard, someone else scrubbing soot from a fireplace, another carefully hanging fresh linens to dry, and yet another replacing the rushes beneath your feet. Their names have almost all been lost to history, but their work survives in every castle that remained comfortable enough for generations of people to call home. And perhaps that's the quiet lesson hidden within these old walls. History is often told through the lives of kings, queens, and famous warriors, but civilizations are sustained by ordinary people doing ordinary jobs extraordinarily well. Medieval castles did not remain standing because their walls were strong alone. They remained livable because every single morning, long before the castle woke, someone picked up a broom and began all over again. As our quiet walk through the castle comes to an end, it is worth remembering one final detail that medieval cleaners understood better than anyone else. Their work was never actually finished. There was no magical moment when the last floor had been swept, the final fireplace had been cleaned, and every room could simply remain perfect forever. A castle was far too alive for that. It breathed with the rhythm of hundreds of people going about their daily lives, and every one of those lives created another small task waiting patiently around the next corner. Perhaps, while one servant was carefully sweeping the great hall, another messenger was already crossing the drawbridge with muddy boots after riding 50 miles through rain. Somewhere in the kitchens, a cook accidentally spilled a sack of flour across the floor. Upstairs, a child belonging to one of the noble families had probably left a trail of toys or clothing behind without giving a second thought. Down in the stables, horses continued doing exactly what horses have always done, creating yet another job for someone before lunchtime. Even the fireplaces, quietly warming the castle against the morning chill, were already producing the next pile of ash that tomorrow's cleaner would have to remove. In many ways, a medieval castle resembled a small modern city more than a house. It had its own supply chains, its own kitchens, workshops, offices, storage rooms, sleeping quarters, places of worship, military headquarters, and sometimes even gardens and farms operating just beyond its walls. Every one of those places demanded attention. Everyone produced dirt. Everyone relied on someone whose name history almost never bothered to record. It is rather remarkable how invisible good cleaning becomes. Imagine visiting a beautifully restored castle today. You admire the towering walls, the magnificent fireplaces, the carved wooden ceilings, and the elegant tapestries. You might spend hours learning about famous kings, powerful queens, dramatic sieges, or legendary battles. But it is unlikely that you will pause beside a neatly swept stone floor and think, someone must have worked incredibly hard to keep this place looking respectable. Cleanliness has always had this curious quality. When everything is in order, nobody notices. Only when something is neglected does it suddenly become everyone's concern. That was just as true 700 years ago. A lord might never compliment the servant who quietly polished the dining table each morning. But if guests arrived to find dust covering the furniture or ashes overflowing from the fireplace, someone would almost certainly be asked an uncomfortable question. Success meant remaining unnoticed. Failure was impossible to ignore. It was an unfair arrangement, perhaps, but one that countless workers accepted simply because it was part of the job. There is something strangely comforting about that endless routine. Every morning began in much the same way. Fires were lit. Water was carried. Floors were swept. Laundry was washed. Meals were prepared. Evening came, the castle filled with conversation, laughter, arguments, celebrations, and ordinary life. And by the following dawn, the entire process quietly began again. Seasons changed. Kings grew older. Children became adults. Wars came and went. but the rhythm of daily work remained astonishingly constant. History often focuses on moments of great excitement. Yet most people, even those living inside magnificent castles, spent their lives repeating familiar routines that gave order to each passing day. Perhaps that is one reason these forgotten jobs feel so familiar to us. The tools have changed beyond recognition. A modern cleaner might carry a vacuum cleaner instead of a birch broom, press a washing machine start button instead of heating water over an open fire, or wipe a kitchen counter with a spray bottle rather than a cloth dipped in lye. Yet the purpose remains almost exactly the same. We still clean because homes become messy. We still wash clothes because they become dirty. We still tidy our surroundings because people naturally feel more comfortable in places that are cared for. Across more than 7 centuries, that simple truth has hardly changed at all. So, the next time you find yourself sighing as you vacuum the living room, wipe fingerprints from a window, or wonder why the laundry basket somehow filled up again despite your best efforts only yesterday, spare a quiet thought for the men and women who cared for medieval castles. They performed those same kinds of tasks on a scale almost impossible to imagine, without electricity, without running water, without modern tools, and often before the sun had even risen. Their reward was rarely fame, rarely wealth, and almost never a place in the history books. Yet without their quiet dedication, the castles we admire today would never have functioned as homes at all. And now, as the last candle burns low in the great hall and the castle gradually settles into silence once more, you can imagine those same stone corridors finally empty. The fires crackle softly in the hearths. The floors have been swept for another day. Fresh rushes lie neatly across the hall. The kitchen has fallen quiet. Somewhere beyond the thick castle walls, the wind moves gently across the countryside, while inside, the people who spent the entire day cleaning finally have a chance to rest. Tomorrow, before dawn, they will do it all again. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the forgotten world of medieval castle life. If you enjoyed this peaceful dive into history, I'd love for you to subscribe to Blanket Histories for more relaxing stories from the past. Whether it's the strange jobs no one remembers, the hidden routines of royal life, or the everyday experiences that history books often overlook, there's always another quiet corner of the past waiting to be explored. For now, wherever you are in the world, I hope you're warm, comfortable, and perhaps a little more grateful for your vacuum cleaner. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next journey through history.